The sun lazily dipped over the rusted rooftops of El Encanto, a neighborhood forgotten by God and remembered only by fear. The streets, once filled with children's laughter and the aroma of fresh bread, now smelled of gunpowder and despair. Among closed stalls and furtive glances walked a man who seemed not to belong there. Don Pancho, a chubby old man with slow steps and a downcast gaze, moved forward with his cloth bag hanging from his arm. His prominent belly and clumsy gait made him an easy target for mockery. Every morning, the same drug dealers on the corner waited for him to laugh at him, push him, knock his hat to the ground, or simply spit on his shoes. No one intervened. No one dared. "Look who's coming, the sack of potatoes with legs," one of them would say, while the others laughed like hyenas. But what no one knew, not even the oldest in the neighborhood, was that Don Pancho wasn't always like this. There was a time when his name was spoken with respect, even fear. A time when his fists spoke louder than his words, and his body, though robust, was a machine trained to endure and strike. Today, however, he was just another old man in a world that had lost its memory. What is about to happen will forever change the history of El Encanto. Because sometimes the past isn't dead. It's just waiting for the right moment to return. Stay until the end, because this story will show you that true strength isn't seen on the surface. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. At 6:30 sharp, the same ritual. Don Pancho left his house with a slow step, dragging his right foot slightly, as if the ground itself weighed him down. His shirt always buttoned to the collar, and his wide-brimmed hat were part of a routine that hadn't changed for decades. The only new thing was the insults, increasingly creative, increasingly cruel. El Encanto, which was once a haven for workers and working families, had been swallowed by the shadow of drug trafficking. Young men with machine guns hanging from their chests dominated the corners as if they were emperors. The law was a memory, hope a luxury. On the corner of the main street, a group of 5 boys smoked marijuana and played at pointing unloaded weapons at each other, laughing loudly. Among them, one stood out, tall, skinny, with a red cap tilted to the side and a scar that crossed his left eyebrow. He called himself El Cucho. "Here comes the human Michelin," he shouted when he saw Don Pancho. "Watch out, he'll roll." The laughter exploded like firecrackers. One of the boys stepped forward, slapped the old man's hat and threw it to the ground. "Pick it up, old man, and if you can, do it without falling, okay?" Don Pancho calmly bent down. He didn't say a word. His trembling fingers picked up the hat, shook off the dust and put it back on his head. He kept walking as if nothing had happened, but his eyes, behind those thick glasses, were more alive than they seemed. Upon arriving at Doña Marta's grocery store, the woman offered him a tight smile. "Don't pay them any mind, Pancho. They're scoundrels, but they won't last forever." "Thanks, Martita." "Don't worry, one gets used to it." Doña Marta knew it wasn't true. No one gets used to being humiliated. From the window on the second floor, Carlitos, a boy of just 9 years old, watched everything carefully. He always did. His mother forbade him from going out when the gang was in the street, but he found fascination in the figure of Don Pancho. There was something different about that old man, something that didn't fit. That afternoon, as Don Pancho returned along the same road, he found something different. One of the drug dealers, the youngest, a guy named Peluche, had written in red spray paint on the wall of his house, "Useless old man, get out." Don Pancho stared at it for a few seconds. Then he went into his house without saying anything. But that night, while the city slept, the sound of a brush scrubbing bricks could be heard. Carlitos peeked out the window. There was Don Pancho kneeling, cleaning the paint with a mixture of vinegar and baking soda. It took him almost an hour. He didn't use gloves. He didn't complain. The next day, the wall was clean. And in that small, silent act, something changed. Not for the drug dealers who didn't even notice, but for Carlitos, who ran down the stairs and sat on the sidewalk to wait for the old man to pass. When he saw him coming, he raised his hand in a shy greeting. "Good morning, Don Pancho." The old man stopped. He looked at him for a moment as if he didn't know how to react. Then he smiled slightly and raised his hat in respect. "Good morning, champ." It was the first time in years that someone had called him that. As he continued on his way, the wind blew strongly, stirring up dust and dry leaves. One of them fell right on a small bundle under the porch of his house. It was an old wooden box, dusty and forgotten, that he had decided long ago never to open again. That leaf, so insignificant, had marked the beginning of the end of the silence. The box was still there. Don Pancho hadn't touched it in years. He had kept it under the porch like someone burying a ghost, with the hope that it would never return. But something stirred inside him when he saw it. Maybe it was Carlitos's greeting that morning. Maybe it was the phrase painted on his wall. Or maybe it was simply time. That night, when the neighborhood seemed to sleep, Don Pancho sat in his old cracked leather armchair, the box on his knees. His heavy hands trembled as he removed the rusty latch. When he opened it, the smell of aged leather and old paper hit him like a physical memory. There were his boxing gloves, tanned and frayed, a yellow mouthguard, a torn bandage, and at the bottom, a folder with newspaper clippings. Francisco the Hammer Ramirez, victory by KO in the second round. The prodigy of the ghettos who makes the heavyweights tremble. The new idol of underground boxing. Don Pancho sighed deeply. His reflection in the window returned the gaze of a man who had been much and had ended up being little. He put everything back, but this time he didn't lock the box. Meanwhile, in a house 2 streets down, another box was also opening, a box with weapons. El Rata, the rat, was the real face behind the group that dominated El Encanto. At 28, he had turned the neighborhood into his fortress. During the day, he barely showed himself. At night, he became shadow and sentence. No one challenged him, not even the police. He was tattooed up to his neck. On his chest, he had a skull biting a rose. His gaze was sharp, but not loud. He wasn't like El Cucho or Peluche. He commanded with silences and bullets. And although no one had seen him in weeks, his presence was constant, like a threat that was breathed. That night, El Rata received a message. "Problematic old man cleaning his own wall," said the audio recorded by El Cucho. Rata was silent for a moment. "And you let him?" "Well, yeah, boss. He's an old man." The silence on the other side was longer. "I don't want anyone to think they're brave. Break something on that old man tomorrow, something that can't be fixed with soap." Cucho swallowed. "As you command." The next day, Don Pancho went out as usual. Carlitos was waiting for him on the sidewalk, this time with a notebook in his hand. "Is it true that you were a boxer?" Don Pancho stopped. He blinked. "Who told you that?" "I heard it in the store. Doña Marta told a man that you fought like a bull in the 80s. Is it true?" Pancho looked at him seriously for a moment. Then he smiled, but without showing his teeth. "That was a long time ago, Carlitos, in another life." "And why did you quit?" The question hung in the air. Pancho didn't answer. He kept walking, but that morning he didn't make it to the store. Halfway there, a young man with a hood crossed his path. Without saying anything, he threw a stone at his chest. The impact was dry, strong. Don Pancho fell to the ground, gasping. "Warning from the boss, don't interfere, old man." The attacker escaped on a bicycle. Carlitos ran towards him. "Don Pancho! Don Pancho!" The old man got up with difficulty, holding his side. "I'm fine, son. Don't tell your mother anything. Don't get involved either." Carlitos helped him walk to his house. No one else came out. No one else looked. The whole neighborhood was hostage to silence. That night, Don Pancho opened the box again. This time he took out the gloves and put them on the table. He also took out a letter, folded in 4, handwritten in faded blue ink. It was from his old trainer, El Toro Mendoza, the bull. "Francisco, there are no blows harder than the ones you receive inside. But if life ever forces you to return to the ring, remember, you don't fight for glory, but for dignity." Don Pancho squeezed the gloves in his hands. Outside, the laughter of the drug dealers sounded like echoes of an undeclared war. And he, for the first time in years, thought about fighting. The early morning in El Encanto had a strange silence. It wasn't calm. It was a pause. A pause before the thunder. Don Pancho hadn't slept. The gloves were still on the table, as if watching him, as if talking to him. At dawn, he decided to go down to the basement. He hadn't set foot in it for years. He walked down the steps with difficulty, lighting the way with a rusty flashlight. The smell of dampness and old wood tightened his chest. but he continued. There, among boxes of tools and dusty memories, he found what he was looking for, a black suitcase covered in cobwebs. He dragged it to the light of the backyard and opened it. Inside, he kept his past. Photos with El Toro Mendoza raising his arm, posters of underground fights in seedy gyms, a red robe with the initials FR embroidered in gold. And at the bottom, an oxidized bronze medal with the inscription, National Amateur Boxing Tournament Champion, 1985. The contact with those objects made the memories return with brutal clarity. He was 25 years old. He was fast, strong, but what set him apart was his cool head. The hammer, they called him for the precision of his blows. His fights were like clocks, every movement measured, every impact calculated. The most important one occurred one night in an illegal warehouse where he faced a feared rival. El Buitre Salgado, the vulture, tall, aggressive, with a reputation for having broken jaws and dreams. Pancho not only beat him, he knocked him out in the third round with a hook to the liver that made the audience scream. But that same night, in the locker room, El Toro told him something he would never forget. Today you earned respect, Pancho. But remember, fighting isn't just throwing punches, it's knowing when not to. Those words resonated with him more strongly now, after so many years of silence. That afternoon, Carlitos reappeared with the notebook in his hand. Will you teach me how to punch, Don Pancho? Pancho looked at him with a raised eyebrow. And what do you want to learn how to punch for? To defend myself. At school they push me and my mom says not to get into trouble, but I understand, son. But punching isn't the first solution. Then why did you do it? The question disarmed him. He was silent. Then he sat on the porch and gestured for him to come closer. I'm going to tell you something. Once I had to fight a guy twice as big as me. He wanted to destroy me. I was scared, you know. But I learned that fear can be used if you turn it into respect. Did you beat him? Yes. But it wasn't because of strength. It was because of thinking. Carlitos smiled. Then teach me to think like a boxer. Don Pancho let out a brief, dry laugh, as he hadn't been heard in years. Tomorrow at 6. But don't tell your mom anything. Carlitos nodded excitedly. As the sun went down and painted the walls of the neighborhood with reddish tones, Don Pancho looked at his gloves again. They were no longer a symbol of past glory, but a tool that could have a new purpose. However, something worried him. A note had appeared on his door, pinned with a rusty knife. We don't want heroes in this neighborhood. Last warning. The handwriting was irregular, shaky, as if written by someone hurried or angry. Pancho wasn't alarmed. It wasn't the first threat he had received in his life. But this time, he didn't plan to ignore it. That night, as he put the medal in the pocket of his red robe, the echo of a memory made his soul tremble. El Toro Mendoza, standing in an empty gym, had once told him, "One day you will understand that gloves are not for winning fights, Pancho. They are for protecting what you love." And now, for the first time in a long time, Pancho had something and someone to use them for again. The sky of El Encanto dawned gray, covered by a thick fog that seemed to drag the sins of the neighborhood. At 6 o'clock, Don Pancho was already in the backyard with an old rope in his hands. His breathing was slow, measured. The sound of the jump rope broke the silence like a metronome of resistance. Carlitos arrived on time, with his eyes shining with excitement and a shirt 3 sizes too big for him. "What are we going to do today, Don?" "First, learn to breathe." The boy frowned. "Breathe?" "A good boxer doesn't live on punches. He lives on rhythm." Pancho taught him to stand with his feet firm, to keep his guard up, and to move his body as if he were dancing, not fighting. At first, Carlitos tripped over his own feet, but every time he fell, he got up with more enthusiasm. As the boy sweated and smiled, Don Pancho felt his body awaken. Each movement was a muscular memory that returned, as if it had been asleep waiting. But along with that rebirth, there was also a voice that he could not silence, that of his last fight. It wasn't in a ring, it was in an alley. A man had challenged him for money, a young guy with hunger and hatred. Pancho, already retired at that time, accepted out of pride. The fight was brutal. He knocked him down in seconds but didn't stop. He hit him once more and another until he felt the crunch of bones under his fist. The boy was hospitalized. He never walked again. Since then, Don Pancho had put away the gloves, not out of cowardice, out of shame. That guilt even today haunted him. Carlitos knew nothing of that. For him, Pancho was a hero rescued from a lost tale. Did you fight with many? Yes, and with one who taught me more than all of them. And did you beat him? No, but he made me see something important. Carlitos looked at him with blind admiration. Pancho looked away. He didn't want to be an idol, just an old man trying to do the right thing. Later, as he walked towards Doña Marta's store, he noticed something strange. The street was empty. Very empty. The windows closed, the doors ajar, as if the neighborhood were holding its breath. Upon reaching the corner, he saw him, El Rata, supported against a black car, smoking, wearing a light gray jacket and dark glasses. Beside him, two men who weren't from the neighborhood, silent, like statues with knives in their pockets. Pancho didn't stop, but his steps slowed. El Rata, the rat, looked him up and down without moving. Then he barely smiled. They say you were good with your fists. Pancho didn't respond. They also say you're old now. That time has escaped you like air from broken balloons. Pancho stopped. He looked at him without fear. Are you finished? No. This is just beginning. You're getting involved where you shouldn't. I'm just walking where I've always walked, but now you do it with the look of someone who wants to fight again. Silence. I don't like competition, old man, and especially not when it comes with nostalgia. Pancho took a deep breath. I don't compete anymore, I only protect. El Rata let out a short laugh. Then protect, if you can. But when all this falls apart, don't say I didn't warn you. Without waiting for a response, he got into the car. The windows closed, the engine roared, and in seconds they disappeared down the avenue. Don Pancho continued on his way, but something inside him had changed. The confrontation was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. That night, he took out his gloves again. This time he hung them on the wall in front of the table, like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. The tension in El Encanto was no longer invisible. It was thick, palpable. The neighbors crossed the streets without looking to the sides, as if they feared that a wrong glance would turn them into a target. The presence of El Rata in broad daylight had been a clear signal. Something was about to break. Don Pancho felt it in his skin. Every step outside his house was an act of defiance, and he knew it, not out of bravery, but because surrendering wasn't among his options. Carlitos kept going to the improvised training yard every morning. He could now jump rope without tripping, throw jabs more fluidly, and even understood when to breathe and when to hold his breath. But that day, the boy didn't arrive. Pancho waited. 10 minutes, then 15. Finally, he went to Doña Marta's house, knowing that everything could be seen from there. The woman greeted him with a pale face. Pancho, something happened. What? Carlitos. He was beaten up. Pancho felt his heart stop for a second. What are you saying? Two of those beasts. They grabbed him leaving the store. They say it was a warning. They pushed him against a wall. Nothing serious, but where is he? At home. His mother is a sea of tears. Don Pancho walked there without saying a word. He knocked on the door gently. It was Carlitos' mother who opened it. Her eyes were red. I'm sorry, she said barely. I don't want him to get near him anymore. It's not because of you, but I can't risk him. He's my only son. Pancho nodded respectfully. I understand, Mom. And I don't blame you. Carlitos appeared behind her with a bandage on his arm and a look full of shame. It wasn't your fault, champ, said Pancho, without him needing to speak. But you have to be careful. This is just beginning. That night, Don Pancho didn't sleep. He walked around his house like a caged animal, reviewing every threat, every blow, every silence of the neighborhood, until, in an impulse he couldn't control, he took an old tarp from the shed and covered the backyard. He hung a thick rope from the tin roof and tied it to a sandbag that he had used to hold down the roofs in storms. That same night, he transformed it into a punching bag. With improvised bandages on his hands, he began to hit it with contained rage. Each punch carried a name: El Rata, Cucho, Peluche, fear, guilt, injustice. Sweat soaked his old shirt. His breathing became a thick pant. His heart beat against his chest like a war drum, but he didn't stop. Not until the bag was spinning slowly, as if dizzy from so many memories. The next morning, the neighborhood woke up to an unexpected scene. On the door of Don Pancho's house, hung with wire from a gate, was the young Peluche stuffed animal. Not injured, not dead. Just unconscious, with a broken nose and a sign hanging from his neck that read, "This is for touching a child." The rumor spread like fire. Who was it? They say it was Don Pancho. It can't be. The fat man. I saw him training. That old man has hands of stone. No one had proof, no one spoke out loud, but everyone knew. And that day, the neighborhood breathed differently. People began to look at Don Pancho with different eyes, not as the lump who cleaned his wall in silence, but as the man who perhaps could make them believe in something again. And although no one said it, everyone also knew what it meant. War had been declared, and there was no turning back. The news of the settling of accounts with young Peluche spread through the neighborhood like a hot wind. On the corners, they were talking about nothing else. Some took it as a legend, others as a warning. But deep down, everyone knew that Don Pancho had crossed an invisible line, a line that separates the ordinary citizen from the man who decides to fight. Don Pancho knew it. That's why that morning, he didn't go out for a walk. Instead, he locked himself in his patio, closed the curtains of his house, and turned the small backyard into an improvised gym. He nailed 2 tires to the ground to practice displacement, hung plastic bottles with water to work on precision, and reinforced the sandbag with black packing tape. It was like going back to the 80s, but with a body that no longer responded the same. The first few days were hard. His right knee creaked when turning, his back resented when hitting, and his breathing shortened before the second minute. But he kept going. Every day, every free hour. He wasn't training to fight. He was training to resist. Doña Marta, seeing the transformation, began to leave him empanadas on the gate. Other neighbors timidly offered cold water, a shovel, tools. No one said anything, but everyone understood. Something big was brewing. One afternoon, Carlitos sneaked in behind the house and saw him training. He remained silent, crouched behind a wall, watching as his old mentor threw quick combinations, with sweat dripping from his chin and a serene fury in his eyes. "Don Pancho," he said finally. Pancho turned, surprised but not annoyed. "I told you not to come." "I couldn't help it. I want to learn, even if my mom doesn't want me to." The old man sighed. He took off his gloves with effort. "This isn't a game, son. This isn't boxing for sport. It's survival." "Then I have more reason to learn." Pancho looked at him, measuring each word. "I'll teach you, but with one condition. Never use what you learn to hurt someone out of pride, understood?" Carlitos nodded, serious as never before. From that day on, the afternoons were filled with movement. As the sun went down, in the backyard of the old man's house, the dry sounds of fists hitting the bag, the rhythmic bounce of the rope, and Don Pancho's firm corrections could be heard. But while they trained in another corner of the neighborhood, El Rata was planning. Peluche, still with a bandaged nose and broken dignity, related everything he could. "It was the old man. I swear it was him. He moved like a bull. He didn't even give me time to scream." El Rata listened in silence. Then he poured himself a drink of rum and watched the smoke from the cigar rise slowly. "So the old man wants war? Perfect." He called 2 trusted men. They weren't from the neighborhood. They were from outside, cold types, with no history, professionals. "I want you to watch him, day and night. I want to know who he talks to, what he does, what time he sleeps. And if he trains, I want to know how. The next blow won't be with stones. It will be with fire." Meanwhile, Pancho was beginning to notice that he was being watched. Shadows that faded when he turned, silhouettes parked in front of his house with cheap excuses. He wasn't scared, but he understood something vital. He couldn't do it alone. That night after dinner, he walked to an abandoned workshop on the outskirts of the neighborhood. He knocked 3 times on a rusty door. It was opened by a huge man with gray hair and a thick beard. He had a scar over his collarbone and an eye that looked down. Pancho. Jaguar. They looked at each other for a long few seconds. Then, the other broke the silence with a nostalgic smile. "I thought you were never going to look for me again. I need help." Jaguar let him in without saying more. And so in the sleeping heart of the neighborhood, a silent alliance began to rise. A resistance. Jaguar's old workshop smelled of grease, old gunpowder, and secrets. It was a large space, with high ceilings and tools hanging meticulously on the walls. But the most striking thing was the improvised ring in the back, surrounded by used tires and ropes stretched with rusty hooks. There, where engines used to be repaired, decisions were now being forged. Jaguar, whose real name no one remembered, had been a feared rival in the underground circuit. In his youth, he had fought Pancho in a mythical battle that ended in a draw and mutual fractures. But life away from the ring had separated them. One retired to silence, the other to the shadows. "Are you sure about this, Pancho?" asked Jaguar as he poured coffee into 2 metal cups. "It's not a fight, it's a war. And the neighborhood is already losing it," replied Pancho, with his gaze fixed on the void. "We need to organize, or they're going to end up destroying everything." They spent hours drawing improvised maps on cardboard boxes. Pancho marked observation points, escape routes, houses of neighbors who had not yet been taken by fear. Jaguar proposed strategies, thought of as if the neighborhood were a ring. That same night, they called a meeting in Pancho's backyard. A dozen neighbors attended. Doña Marta, the mechanic Bruno, the pastor Elias, 2 young medical students, and even a lady who could barely walk, but who offered her house as a lookout point. "We're not going to attack," said Pancho with a firm voice. "We're going to resist, we're going to organize, because it's not just about us anymore, it's about our children." The faces reflected fear, but also determination. It was the first time in years that someone had spoken out loud against the dominance of the drug dealers, and that voice didn't come from a politician or a policeman. It came from a fat old man who everyone thought was defeated. Carlitos was among the attendees with a notebook where he wrote everything down. "What happens if they counterattack?" he asked without mincing words. "They will," replied Jaguar, "but this time we're not going to run." They began to train in secret. Each neighbor had a task. Some reinforced doors and windows, others watched movements from rooftops. The ladies wove nets with old sheets to block access. Bruno, the mechanic, set up homemade traps with used oil and nails. And Pancho, every day, taught them how to dodge, move, keep their guard up. The neighborhood was transformed into a preparation camp. The looks were no longer of resignation, but of alertness. Everyone knew something was coming, but for the first time, they weren't going to wait for it sitting down. El Rata, upon learning of the unusual movements, did not react with immediate violence. He watched from a distance. His men took photos, listened to conversations, reported every detail. "The old man is starting a revolution," said one of his hitmen. "People are listening to him." Rata chewed a toothpick with contained rage. "Then it's time to end the hero stories." He ordered a surprise attack to be prepared, nothing massive, just enough to demoralize, so they knew who was in charge. But Pancho sensed it, and that's why he decided on the final step, to let himself be seen. He walked through the center of the neighborhood, wearing a faded red robe, the same one with which he had won his last official fight. On the back, the embroidered letters, FR, shone in the sun. Everyone looked at him, some amazed, others in silence. The younger ones recorded with their cell phones. It was as if a legend had decided to be reborn in broad daylight. The message was clear: "I'm ready and I'm not alone." That night, as the sky turned black and the murmurs grew like shadows on the walls, Pancho and Jaguar finished reviewing the last map of the neighborhood. "Ready for what's coming?" asked Jaguar, adjusting his bandaged knuckles. Pancho nodded, without taking his eyes off the map. Tomorrow everything changes, and the neighborhood, silent, held its breath. knowing that the storm was approaching. Night fell on El Encanto with an unnatural silence. No dogs, no motorcycles, no laughter were heard. The air was thick, as if something invisible was squeezing it. The streets, usually lit by dim lights, were now dark, but not by accident. It was a decision. Don Pancho, from the roof of his house, observed everything with surgical precision. Each surveillance point was occupied. Doña Marta with her binoculars from the second-floor window, Bruno on the corner with his portable radio. The medical students with ready backpacks turned into improvised paramedics. And Jaguar, with his reinforced vest and fixed gaze, patrolling the corridors like an old wolf. "Ready, old man?" asked Jaguar, climbing the stairs with silent steps. "More than ever," replied Pancho, adjusting the bandage on his wrist. "And the boys?" "In position. The neighborhood seems asleep, but we're awake." They had agreed on a signal, 3 brief power outages, which would cause the solar lights on the rooftops to turn off and on. It was simple, but effective. No one had firearms, only traps, stones, bats, chains. It was resistance, not war. But the enemy wasn't coming to play. At 2:17 in the morning, a black car entered the main avenue without lights. Then 2 motorcycles. Behind, 3 figures walking with a firm step, armed. The neighbors watched them from the shadows, holding their breath. The signal arrived. The lights flickered 3 times. And then, everything began. On the first street, a man tried to force a door. He didn't expect the doorknob to be electrified with an old battery. He fell to the ground, screaming. Another stepped on a trap of nails hidden under dry leaves. He screamed, but was silenced with a bucket of cold water and a chain on his leg. The surprise was total. The attackers didn't understand what was happening. The neighborhood, which they used to control with fear, now responded with coordination and precision. In the middle of the chaos, a figure emerged from the shadows. Don Pancho. He wore his red robe, the gloves on, his eyes lit. He walked slowly without fear among the sounds of footsteps, screams, and falling objects. Carlitos saw him from the window and felt something impossible to describe. It was like seeing a superhero that only he knew existed. Pancho was headed towards one thing, the epicenter. There in the middle of the central street was El Cucho, flanked by 2 men who weren't from the neighborhood. One was holding a sawed-off shotgun, the other a metal crowbar. Jaguar appeared on the right flank, making signals. Pancho nodded. No need to talk. Suddenly, a firecracker exploded in the distance. Distraction signal. The enemies turned for an instant, and it was enough. Bruno and another neighbor threw an old mattress over the armed aggressors. Jaguar launched a kick at one, disarming him. Pancho went straight for Cucho. "You? The fat guy?" Cucho stammered. "Me!" The first blow was a dry jab to the chest, enough to destabilize him. The second, a hook to the side, doubled him over. But Pancho didn't finish him off. He just looked him in the eyes. "The fear is over, kid." Cucho fell to his knees without responding. He hadn't trained for this. He hadn't lived long enough to understand what it was like to fight for something more than money. In another corner, a fire began to spread from an abandoned house. Shouts, smoke, confusion. Some neighbors became disorganized. Carlitos came out of his house with a hose, trying to put out the flames. No one ordered him to. He just did it. And then a figure appeared on the opposite corner. El Rata, the rat. With a disturbing calm, he watched the chaos from afar. He didn't speak. He just watched. Pancho also saw him. And for the first time in years, both knew that the encounter was inevitable. The neighborhood would never be the same after that night. But the worst was yet to come. El Rata advanced like a specter through the shadows, his silhouette outlined by the flames of the burning house in the background. He wore a tight black jacket and leather gloves. He didn't come accompanied. He didn't need to. His mere presence was a threat. Don Pancho stepped forward, moving away from the neighbors who were running from one side to the other, trying to put out the fire. He did it in silence, with a determination that was noticeable in his controlled breathing. in the way he slowly clenched his fists. Both men stood staring at each other from opposite sides of the street. "So you're the problem," Rata said with a smirk. "No, kid. The problem was letting you grow up believing the neighborhood was yours." Rata spat on the ground with contempt. "You could have stayed in your chair watching soap operas, but you got delusions of grandeur. That's going to cost you dearly." "I'm old, yes, but I haven't forgotten how to fight." A second of silence. Then Rata took off his jacket, revealing a torso covered in tattoos. On his right shoulder was a drawing of a clenched fist pierced by a dagger. "Today I'm sending you back to the hospital." "Or the cemetery." Don Pancho didn't respond. He just raised his fists and took a deep breath, focusing his gaze. All the training, all the guilt, all the repressed fury was concentrated in that moment. And then it began. Rata lunged first, fast as a viper. His style was street, dirty, direct, without technique. Pancho blocked the first blow with his forearm, but the second, a punch to the side, knocked the wind out of him. He stepped back 2 steps, but he didn't fall. He responded with a jab to the chin, dry, that made Rata stagger. The crowd began to gather around, in silence. No one shouted, no one intervened. It was a duel, 2 worlds colliding, 2 ways of life in conflict. Rata tried to sweep him with a low blow, but Pancho anticipated it, turning his torso with an elegance that seemed impossible for his age. He returned a hook to the liver that made Rata let out a grunt of pain. "Old man of," he managed to say, before another blow forced him to retreat. The fight turned into a frenetic dance. Each blow was a declaration. Pancho resisted, but his legs began to tremble. Age weighed him down. His breathing became shorter. Rata, on the other hand, became more savage with each second. He hit with rage, with frustration. He didn't understand how this old man resisted. He didn't understand why fear didn't work. A direct hit to the face made Pancho stumble, blood at the corner of his lip. Carlitos from a balcony shouted his name. Jaguar clenched his teeth but didn't move. He knew that this was a fight that Pancho had to finish alone. Rata took advantage of the distraction and rammed him with his shoulder, throwing him to the ground. The silence was absolute. Pancho was on his knees, breathing with difficulty. The ground was hot. His body was on fire. Rata raised his fist, ready to finish him off. "It's over, old man, and you are nothing more than a memory, and memories are buried." But when he lowered his arm, Pancho rolled to the side and dodged him by inches. From the ground, he launched an uppercut that hit him in the jaw. Rata staggered. Pancho stood up with effort. He was bleeding from his eyebrow and lip, but his eyes were shining. He shook off the dust. He returned to his guard. Again. "You want to finish this? Then come on." Rata roared and lunged with all his weight. Pancho didn't dodge. This time, he received the blow to the chest, but he held it. He cushioned with his feet and turned his torso. He counterattacked with a combination of 3 blows, side, chin, and finally a cross that exploded in Rata's face. The narco leader fell on his back. A second of pause. But then, something changed. From the darkness, a figure appeared and pointed a gun at Pancho. The fight was not over yet. The gun gleamed under the dim light of a flickering post. It was a short, black revolver, with the mouth pointing directly at Don Pancho's chest. The figure holding it was one of the outsiders brought by Rata. Cold eyes. Tight jaw. Deadly silence. Pancho didn't move, not out of bravery, but because he knew that at that distance, any gesture would be his last. Jaguar from the corner was already in motion, but he wouldn't arrive in time. Then a scream cut through the air. "No!" It was Carlitos. The boy had run down from his house. No one had seen him coming. He was unarmed, but his voice, high-pitched and desperate, was enough to disconcert the gunman for a fraction of a second. And in that instant, a click was heard. The gun didn't fire. The trigger failed. The hitman, confused, looked at his weapon, and that second was all Pancho needed. With a deep roar, as if coming from the depths of his soul, he lunged against the armed man. Not with a blow, but with his whole body. He pushed him with such force that both fell to the ground, rolling among stones and dirt. The gun went flying far away into the darkness. The outsider got up first and kicked Pancho in the side. The old man groaned in pain but didn't fall. He responded with a headbutt straight to the nose, which destabilized him. Then a series of short, dry blows directed at the neck and torso. The guy fell to his knees. Pancho stood up, panting. He was bleeding from everywhere. His knees were trembling. His arms felt like lead. But he didn't give up. It was then that a white light illuminated the entire scene. A police van entered the neighborhood. For a second, everyone was paralyzed. A man with a bulletproof vest and a camera in his hand got out of the van. It was one of the medical students. He had been recording all night with a micro camera in his backpack. Every blow, every threat, every weapon. "We have everything recorded," he shouted. "Everything is in the cloud. If something happens to someone here, this will reach the media." El Rata, still on the ground, understood what that meant. He no longer controlled fear, and without fear his empire was nothing. The outsiders fled. Some narcos from the neighborhood tried to disappear into the shadows, but the lights of cell phones lit up everywhere. People came out into the street. There was no longer silence, there was no longer terror. Pancho fell to his knees, not out of surrender but out of exhaustion. Carlitos ran towards him and hugged him without saying a word. "We won, Don Pancho," he murmured. The old man smiled, barely. "We didn't win. We resisted. That's enough." The police, who rarely entered the neighborhood, this time had no choice. The evidence was irrefutable. The images circulated on social networks that same morning. "Old boxer faces narco leader in defense of the neighborhood," said the first headlines. The journalists arrived at dawn. The patrols, half an hour later. El Rata was arrested. But his fall was not only physical, it was symbolic. The El Encanto neighborhood woke up with the feeling of having defeated a monster. And that monster was not defeated with bullets, but with courage, community, and an old man who refused to die of fear. That day, the walls that were previously covered with threats dawned with new words. "Thank you, Don Pancho." The neighborhood doesn't forget. Here was born the resistance. Pancho didn't say much. He just asked for his gloves back. He put them in his box, closed the lid gently, and put it back under the porch. "In case someday," he said without finishing the sentence. Carlitos was next to him. "And now what do we do, Don?" "Now, we live, but be careful." And with that, he sat in his usual armchair with the same hat, the same posture, but with a different story written on his fists. El Encanto was no longer the same. The walls were still old, the cables were still hanging from the streetlights, and the pavement still had cracks. But there was something new in the air, something that couldn't be seen, but could be felt. Respect. Not towards the government nor towards the police, towards themselves, towards the neighborhood. Towards an old man who had remembered what it was like to fight, not with hatred, but with dignity. Don Pancho didn't seek fame. In fact, when the journalists arrived, he refused to give interviews. He only allowed one photo, him and Carlitos, sitting on the sidewalk with the gloves hanging on the gate. Without poses, without medals, only truth. Carlitos returned to school with another attitude. He no longer walked with fear, and everyone knew why. Doña Marta began to organize neighborhood meetings. Jaguar, silent, repaired bicycles on the corner as if he had never disappeared. And Bruno wrote on the wall of his workshop, "Here are forged more than engines." The story of Don Pancho spread by word of mouth until it reached other neighborhoods. Some didn't believe it, others exaggerated it. But in El Encanto, everyone knew the truth, and that truth had a name: Francisco Ramirez. Pancho, the bread guy, the hammer, the man who resisted. And although peace seemed to have returned, Pancho knew that darkness does not completely withdraw. It only retreats, though waiting for a carelessness. That's why every morning before drinking his coffee, he looked at the box under the porch. Sometimes he smiled, sometimes he didn't, because there are battles that end at Kiev and others that are just beginning. If you believe that there are still heroes in the most forgotten corners, subscribe, share this story, and leave your comment. Because El Encanto could be your neighborhood too.